Hello, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rhonda Schaffler, and today we are talking about climate change and what is needed to tackle it. Joining me is Chevron's Corporate Vice President of Strategy and Sustainability, Bruce Niemeyer. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Now, before we get started, I want to remind you, if you have any questions at all, feel free to drop them into the chat. Bruce, welcome again. I want to start with a real big picture kind of question for you. What are the overall challenges that we're facing as we work toward lower carbon intensity?
Rhonda, it's great to be with you today. We believe at Chevron the future of energy is lower carbon, and it's going to require a number of things to come together in order to realize that future. Technology progress is going to be vitally important. The advancement of technology and the deployment of technology in commercial applications and at scale will be critical to our future. Policy aligned to enable that technology to move forward. And then the coming together of all parts of the economy, all sectors, all regions of the world will all be essential in order for us to deliver that lower carbon future.
So what is the role for oil and gas, and what part is energy going to play? Are energy companies going to really do to help us meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement?
That's a great question. Oil and gas today is more than 50% of the energy mix, and the oil and gas sector, the energy sector overall, has a vital role to play. We think about it in three ways in the work that we're doing. The first is reducing the carbon intensity of our operations and doing it in a cost-effective manner so that we can scale it and deliver it broadly across our operations. And we can talk more about a variety of things that we're doing in that space. The second is to deploy new mature technologies in support of our business. So in our case, that's wind and solar. For us, not as a separate line of business, that's being done very effectively by other companies in the economy, and we think that that work will grow. But we think it important to deploy those technologies in support of our business that will help further decarbonize. It's also important that companies introduce new products, and so in that regard, we are introducing and delivering in increasing volumes to market lower carbon fuels, renewable natural gas that's originally made from methane captured at dairy farms, and renewable diesel made from renewable feedstock, and where we're co-processing it in the equipment that we have historically used to produce fossil-based diesel. And then the third is advancing new technologies. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to need new technologies in that low carbon future. Advancing those low carbon technologies, making investments, and importantly, a company like Chevron can play a vital role in commercializing, taking a good idea that's on a drawing board or maybe in a small startup company somewhere, applying it in an industrial setting, demonstrating its commercial capability, and then be involved in the scaling of it, which is necessary for that to be broadly available to society. So working on your existing operations, utilizing new technologies that are mature and ready to go today, and then being part of the solution of advancing new technologies that we'll all need for the future.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there, Bruce, and you started down this road, and I'm just going to take you the next step here. Thanks to one of our viewers who wrote in the chat. Michael, thank you for the question. He would like to hear specifically about Chevron's transition towards renewables from hydrocarbons.
Well, we think that lower carbon future is going to need all forms of energy, and renewables are going to play a very important part of that. We have signed an agreement with a company called Algonquin, who are experts in renewable power, and we're working with them to deploy renewable power across our operations, beginning first with projects in West Texas, Argentina, Western Australia, and Kazakhstan. We think that between Algonquin and Chevron, we have complementary capabilities. We know those geographies very well. We know the local loads. Algonquin is an expert in renewable power, and we think working together is a very important way to further decarbonize energy that is used in so many ways, transportation and other activities in the world. We also think in this space introducing, as I mentioned earlier, new low carbon fuels, which also cause us to partner with different organizations. In the case of renewable natural gas, which is coming from dairies, we're partnering with companies there named Brightmark and CalBio to bring that low carbon fuel into the transportation system in California, and it's a negative carbon replacement for diesel in that case.
So, Bruce, in terms of timing and history of the energy business, solving climate issues, I mean, this is a very complex, detailed issue that we're talking about here. So what is the best way to describe the complexities that helps us understand the efforts that companies like yours are undertaking? And perhaps even more importantly, what about timeline for change and execution? It sounds like there is a lot going on, but what are some of the timelines connected to that?
Well, that's a great question, asking about the complexity of it. I've had the opportunity to talk about the energy transition quite a bit as attention has been drawn further to it. And I don't know that I've been asked in the past about, how complex it is. And it is complex. Energy is something we all rely on every day. It's essential to our lives. It's essential to the enablement of what people seek around the world. It is used in the production of the goods that we consume, the electricity that you use for lighting. It heats and cools our buildings. It allows us to get from place to place. It is so much a part of our life, and we count on it so much. And you think about what does that mean as it makes a transition, and it requires a intersection of a variety of efforts in order for us to be successful. I think one of our observations is that in order for us to accomplish that low carbon future, we're going to need partnerships across society and across the economy as we work towards low carbon solutions. In every case, we are partnered with companies, some that we have partnered with historically, in other cases, new entrants or organizations that we hadn't partnered with historically. And so that complexity, which is probably unprecedented in the human experience, given the scale and the size and how much we all depend on it, is going to require an unprecedented level of cooperation. It's going to require significant deployment of new technology, and it really needs every sector participating. Those that are producing oil and gas, those that are working in renewables, policymakers, folks working in academia, startups, venture capital firms. There's probably no part of society that isn't needed in order to be successful in this very challenging space. Now, having said that, I'm also very optimistic because I can see in my own company the tremendous innovation that is in the process of being unlocked and solving these very challenging and difficult solutions. And we know from our history of about 140 years in the energy business that the energy system has always been in a form of evolution and transition. And so we have the ability to further transition and deliver that low carbon future, but it will absolutely require coming together across all parts of the economy to make that successful.
Bruce, here's a question from Richard in our chat. How will the transition to low carbon impact oil byproducts?
Well, it's important that oil, which not only it finds its end use in transportation, in marine, in aviation, in light duty transportation, heavy duty transportation, but I think the question also goes to it's a feedstock for the things that we depend on so importantly. So in the response to the pandemic, plastics were essential in the supply chains associated with vaccines, with protective equipment that we all relied upon, and oil is in the feedstock of that, as well as everyday items that we use all the time that in many cases don't even realize it has an oil component in it. The industry is very engaged in how do we make that more sustainable going forward. In the case of Chevron, we are a joint venture partner in a company called the Chevron Phillips Chemical, which is a world-class chemical company, and they were several months ago the first to employ circular production of a particular type of plastic, where they took at scale recycled material and turned that into new material for new products going forward. So there's a lot of attention in the chemical part of our industry and in our company in thinking about the full life cycle of plastics, because their use is so important in so many ways, and finding a way to make it more sustainable so that the first use of it can be recycled into future use in a number of ways.
What are the challenges facing investor-owned energy companies in terms of returns versus lower carbon intensity? I'm assuming this is kind of a hard line to straddle.
Yes, in our way of thinking about it, we have four simple words: higher returns, lower carbon. And a lot of today's discussion is about the second, the lower carbon and the energy transition and efforts and challenges associated with that. But long before that had a lot of attention, the attention that it has today, investors, as they looked at our sector, were really focused on returns. And if you go back 10 years or so, our sector occupied somewhere in the mid-teens of a percent of the S&P 500, 14, 13%, something of that nature. And over the last 10 years, that percent of the S&P has steadily dropped because the sector has not been good stewards of investors' capital. And we recognize that in Chevron. That is an area in which we have to do better. We, as a sector, put too much risk on investors for not a commensurate return. And so there are a tremendous number of efforts focused on higher returns, and you can see evidence in our company through the discipline in which we deploy capital and the actions that we take. We are focused on a very tight organic capital range of $14 to $16 billion. We've guided to that range for the next 5 years. In our M&A activity, we refused to get into bidding wars when we had discussions previously where the price would have moved to a place that was not a good transaction for our investors. And during the middle of the pandemic, we're able to make a very valuable transaction in addition to our company by acquiring Noble Energy that was good for the Noble shareholders and good for the Chevron shareholders. And in the energy transition, we will also be disciplined. We think it's important that we are both higher return and lower carbon, and our efforts are focused on accomplishing both. And we have many examples where we are accomplishing those things simultaneously. It's an and world, and we think both are required.
So I just want to circle back for a moment in terms of specific investments in lower carbon technology. What is the approach when you're looking to make those investments, especially in light of what you've just mentioned here?
Well, we think about a number of things. For more than 20 years now, we've had a venture organization called Chevron Technology Ventures, and they have been engaged in venture investment. And historically, maybe 80% of those investments have found their way some way back into Chevron or improved Chevron's business in some way. In the last several years, we've launched venture funds specifically focused on the energy transition. And we're looking in those investments to find promising technologies in places of transition in the energy system where we have an intersection of our interests. And so most recently, we've invested in a variety of things. We've invested in advanced geothermal, new types of geothermal technology that would expand its availability in other parts of the world that it wasn't traditionally able to be used, and that could provide baseload electricity generation. We've invested in offshore wind technology. We've invested in battery technology. We've invested in electric vehicle charging technology and companies. And so we've done a number of those things, but it really gets to the promise of the technology. Does it sit in a place of interest and intersection with our capabilities and the role that we'll have the opportunity to play in the future?
And how about solar?
Solar is going to be an important part of the mix overall. Solar is a very mature technology at this point. We benefited as a society by seeing the cost of solar come down dramatically. And our focus on solar now is around how do we apply it, how do we bring it in an increasing manner into our operations. There are some related technologies that can augment solar, battery technologies in which we have an investment, and some digital technologies that can make work around solar more efficient in how we utilize it. But solar itself, much like wind, while there will continue to be improvements, are very mature technologies at this point. And now our thought is, how do we deploy them? How do we use them?
Bruce, there's a question from the chat from Carl. What's your advice for countries, particularly in Africa, which are heavily dependent on commodities such as coal for powering their electricity power stations, and also for export revenues that they rely on for GDP growth?
Yeah, it's a good question, because the transition that we're seeking must work for all. There are solutions and approaches that sometimes are advanced, which will only work in narrow circumstances, or where you have the wealth distribution to make it possible. We think in support of a transition that all parts of the world can benefit from is a price on carbon, applied at the highest possible level. If it were possible, you'd apply it at a world level, but if not at a world level, at a national level with the right kind of coordinating features in it, that would unlock all sorts of innovation that would allow us to accomplish progress towards the energy transition and low carbon future most cost effectively, and make it most accessible to all regions of the world. It is important to recognize that certain parts of the world, not only do they rely on fossil-based fuels, in the case of the question, coal, but they have other important aspects of their economy, jobs, income, things of that nature. And it's why countries around the world, and that's part of the discussion that will happen at COP26 later this year, how do countries coordinate and collaborate together? Collaboration at the highest possible levels will be important in order to meet the challenges of the various countries around the world, each of which have different starting points, different considerations, and all must be part of the solution, because the low carbon future that we're after is a global solution. It's not success if one sector or one company or one region of the world achieves a low carbon ability in the future. We have to achieve it on a global scale, and that means everybody has to be involved in the efforts going forward.
Sounds like some government policy, as you mentioned, that's coordinated, would really perhaps help solidify some of the efforts.
Absolutely, and we would continue to reinforce, thoughts around, price on carbon because of what it unlocks. We talked earlier about the technologies that we invest in, and we invest in a portfolio of technologies because, like many things that you try that are early days, you're not sure if one or the other is exactly going to work out or exactly go to scale, and we're involved in it every day. If you attempt to pick winners and losers in the technologies that we'll rely on as a society early, it can be equally challenging. A price on carbon enables innovation from all sectors, and I think we will collectively be surprised where innovation comes from, where really creative ideas emerge, and things that we can advance that would benefit all parts of society and all parts of the world. And it's why we're so supportive of a price on carbon, because it has the feature of unlocking that and sending the right price signals and creating the right incentives for so much good work to go on and tap into the natural creativity and innovation which has advanced modern life over the last century.
Well, Bruce, it's been a really fascinating conversation. I want to thank you so much for your time. And that is all the time we have for this session. Thank you to Chevron as well.